Finn Williams is co-founder and chief executive of Public Practice, but recently he was appointed as City Architect of Malmö in Sweden. And so he's going to be moving on from Public Practice, but also Finn was the winner of the first NLA RCA Student Prize. That was many years ago, of course, but we're very pleased to see him becoming just so successful and so influential in the built environment. So, Finn, you commented recently that when you joined the public sector, people thought it was because you couldn't get a job anywhere else. What was it that attracted you to public service in the first place? And do you think attitudes have changed since then?
Thanks, Peter. Yep, this was back in 2008, so not long after that NLA prize. And at that stage, the financial crisis was still unfolding. Austerity hadn't really hit local government yet. But even then, I think there was this sense amongst both colleagues in the private sector and even people I was going to work with in the public sector that I somehow must have only joined Croydon Council because I wasn't able to find a job in private practice. And this sense that public service was a last resort. And that really stuck with me because for me, it was the most exciting move I could make. And for me, it was a privilege to be serving the public. And I wondered, well, what impact is it having on our built environment in general if serving the public, working on the infrastructure that we all really need is seen as somehow second best to serving private interests. And that certainly motivated me throughout my time at Croydon and was one of the underlying factors in the end in probably starting public practice as well. I mean, back then, I think I was motivated to make that move to Croydon Council because I saw the limits as a consultant to how we could influence the built environment. Your work was only ever as good really as your brief. And a lot of the most important decisions seemed to be being made before the start of a contract or in fact after the end of a contract. And at the same time, having worked on the consultant side for local authorities, I'd been really inspired to meet a few humble, relatively anonymous, but strongly principled officers working in places like the City of London, our Hamlets, actually Croydon as well. And that really matched up with a kind of deeper interest I had in the history of publicly led architecture and development in London, which has such a rich history. I've been a trustee of the Friends of Arnold Circus amenity group for a long time, and of course Arnold Circus being the first publicly funded housing in London, but also post-war housing in Camden, Southwark, Lambeth, LCC, GLC, the kind of schemes that I think we were only beginning to really fully appreciate or have been over the last 10 years. And it felt to me like if there was one aspect of the built environment industry that was ripe for reinvention, it was the role of local government. That was fairly, I think that was fairly unusual even then, pre-austerity. I was probably the only person in my year at the Royal College of Art to choose to go on to work in local government. But I think that has changed as well. And now if I go back to the RCA to speak or to other schools like the London School of Architecture or Central St Martin's or UCL or the AA or the CAS, you get mobbed. The public sector is seen as a valid ambition for people's career and an exciting place to be.
So what actually gave you the idea to start public practice, and how did you make it happen?
So I suppose it was partly informed by that experience of working for Croydon Council. I mean, it was actually a privilege for me to work in an extraordinarily talented spatial planning service there, people like Vincent Lacavara, Tom Sweeney in it, but also with really strong leadership all the way up through the council, from Mike Kiley to Emma Peters to John Rouse. And it felt like in that role, you had the luxury of being able to take this longer term approach, not being limited by the terms of a contract or your fees, really getting to know a place and its people, serving those people, and being able to draw on all the different levers that a local authority has, so not being forced into a position where the answer to every problem is a building. And that was an amazing 5 years at Croydon, and some of the influence of those years is still actually playing out now, for better or worse. But it felt like we had something unusual, and I then moved to the GLA to really learn how things worked or didn't work in other local authorities. And it was from that position where it became so obvious, with austerity really starting to hit home by that point, 2013, late 2013, that funding was a barrier, but the biggest barrier to local authorities creating really good quality places was finding the right people. And over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, really built up the evidence and the argument for a different kind of approach to building public sector capacity, kind of bridging between the interest and excitement and demand from practitioners, not necessarily all at the beginning of their careers, across all different built environment disciplines, who wondered what it was like to work on the other side of the table, and the real desperate need within local authorities. And that initially took the form of actually pitching the idea of public practice via the Farrell Review. And I remember a meeting in the basement of the building centre via the NLA with one of those Farrell Review panels, via the Centre for London Conference, and then ultimately integrating it in the idea into a Mayor's Design Advisory Group report for the Good Growth Agendas, which again was presented at the NLA. That must have been just before the mayoral elections, when Sadiq came into power. And it was at that stage that I think there was a wider awareness amongst City Hall of what this idea could do, interest from our former mayor, Boris Johnson, in the idea. And we realised that actually, if we're going to make this happen, this needs to be something that a new administration is behind. So we kind of held it back and presented it as one of the first things that we spoke to with Jules Pipe, who became Deputy Mayor for Planning and became the Chair of Public Practice ultimately. And at that time, Pooja Agrawal joined the GLA and really gave the whole initiative fresh energy and impetus. And over the course of the next 2 years, we developed a kind of co-designed a business plan with local authorities, both in London and outside London, through the East of England LGA. And by 2017 had also attracted enough support from across the sectors, so private sector support from organisations like the Barclay Group, ultimately L&Q, British Land as well, to really justify setting public practice up as an independent organisation. And we spun it out of the GLA as a not-for-profit in October 2017. Around then, at that point, I left and became Chief Executive of Public Practice.
So you must be very pleased with the success it's had, but also in changing attitudes to working in the public sector.
Yeah, it's funny because I think our original theory of change, our idea of what the difference we were going to make, had changing perceptions of public planning, of public services, one of its columns. It had building capacity within local authorities, and then it had developing new forms of practice and sharing practice through our R&D program, the kind of 3 pillars of the program. And I always thought that one around changing perceptions was going to be the hardest to do. The public sector had been really having its power and influence eroded over not just 8 years of austerity, but 30, 40 years of underinvestment, really. And in a funny way, that may be the one area where we've made the biggest impact. So if you look at the way we measure our impact statistically, we've had in the last 3 years nearly 2,500 applications from applicants, from built environment professionals. 93% of them have come from the private sector. We've placed 177 associates in 46 authorities across London, the wider southeast, up to Cambridge, across to Oxford, down to Brighton. That adds up to over 35,000 days of additional resource. And it is mostly additional because something like 94% of our placements are brand new roles, so roles that simply don't exist within established structures, which also gives them real agency and makes them particularly influential. Because we recruit every 6 months, we're able to find some efficiencies of doing that, but also go beyond best practice in terms of particularly equality, diversity and inclusion, which is something we've been pushing really hard from the start. And if you look at those 177 placements so far, 64% have been women, 26% have been people from ethnically diverse backgrounds. Those are just the measurable, the visible aspects of diversity, and there's a long way to go on those fronts, as well as us really understanding the value and benefit of having broader sets of diversity, whether it's neurodiversity, lived experience, disability. And then if you look at the cohorts of associates that have finished so far, 91% have stayed on in the public sector beyond their first 12 months. So that retention and that shift from 93% to the private sector to 91% staying on the public sector is a big turnaround. That network in itself is becoming more powerful than I ever imagined it could, because those associates are going on to new roles in the same authority or different authorities and supporting each other actually throughout their careers. But I think in a funny way, the biggest difference we are making is outside that core program, is outside the 177 placements. It's actually in the 2,000 odd people who've applied to the public sector when they wouldn't necessarily have done it otherwise. And they have often gone into other roles that have been advertised by local authorities in a kind of traditional way. And we often get authorities saying to us, we are seeing a big difference in the quality of applications, the number of applications we're getting. That's not necessarily all to do with public practices. There's been a wider wave, I think, of interest in the role of local government, and that links through to the growth in council-led housing delivery. People like Mariana Mazzucato, really setting out a really bold vision of what the role of the public sector can be. The importance we've seen of the role of place-based publicly led leadership over the last year in the COVID response. I think public practice has just been has been surfing a bigger wave of a shift in perceptions around local government, and that's really exciting to see, because that's the change that will last beyond any one of these placements and the program itself. And I think going back to that original observation around the idea of public service being a last resort, I think if we can change perceptions, that's what in turn will really change the kind of values that we build into our places.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Good Growth Agenda, which was delivered as part of the Mayor's Design Advisory Group. It's a very rare example of a policy, as it were, that moves from one administration to the next and really has an impact on the way that a whole series of policies have been delivered.
And if we get it right, public practice may also be able to shift administrations or scales, so to speak, and actually work at a national level as well. And that we are having conversations with Homes England, with MHELG, with the Office for Place about how public practice as a proven model in the Southeast could be critical in helping to implement a reform agenda, but implement a reform agenda really well in areas that, frankly, probably need public practice more than a number of the areas we're working with in the Southeast. For me, that's a very exciting next stage of public practice. And as an organisation, our goal is to be able to serve and support any authority in England by 2024-25. It won't necessarily be for every authority, and it won't necessarily be the placement programme, but we want to support those everyday places that need built environment expertise most. And the next 2 or 3 years are going to be a really important process as funding and attention is focused on some areas outside of the capital and outside of the Southeast. We want to be there to support it, as well as, of course, as supporting London and the recovery here. That's part of Pooja's mission, taking over as Chief Executive of Public Practice. And honestly, I don't think there's anyone better who could lead that next phase of the organisation, me included. She's going to bring energy and ideas that I couldn't to that next stage in her experience at Homes England as well as the GLA. So I'll be very interested watching from a new position on the board to see how the organisation scales.
So you've got big shoes to fill in Malmö. So what do you see as the main issues that it faces as a city and that you hope to address when you get there?
Well, yeah, this weekend was the 20th anniversary of the opening of Bo Norrlet, so the housing exhibition at the Western Harbour of Malmö that was led by some really visionary people like Claes Tam, but also I suppose the last 20 years of Malmö's development is in particular led by Christer Larsson, who went on, former city architect, but who went on to have a great deal of influence at a national scale as well in Sweden and still does. And I think Malmö has become known not just in Sweden, but internationally for being very progressive in terms of sustainable urban development, particularly focused on that area of the Western Harbour, which is a huge structural economic change in Malmö and Malmö's geography and purpose, really. But I think by their own admission, and Christer would say this, in focusing on that enormous change in the harbour, there are other areas of the city that perhaps were neglected and left behind. And Malmö does have, for Sweden, relatively high levels of inequality. It's an incredibly diverse city. It's its greatest strength, I think. 179 nationalities, a third of the population was born outside Sweden, higher than Stockholm, higher than Gothenburg. It's probably one of the most diverse cities in Scandinavia. It's certainly the fastest growing city in Sweden. It's also one of the youngest. Half its population is under the age of 35. And it's in this very particular location, a very strong position of being at the front door between Sweden and the rest of the world, which in some ways has always put it ahead of other cities, certainly in Sweden, in dealing with both the kind of benefits of international connections, but also some of the challenges as well. And for me, my partner's Swedish. It's always been part of our long-term plan to at some stage move to Scandinavia. And I've always found it hard to position myself in Sweden when on the face of it, things look all right, compared to some of the places I've worked in London. Feels like, well, maybe Sweden doesn't need that much help. But if there's anywhere that has that combination of incredible potential and some really serious social and economic challenges, it's Malmö. It's not quite as bad as Trump made out in that speech a few years ago, where he talked about areas of Malmö being no-go zones. But there are serious differences in inequalities in health and employment and in spatial segregation, and those are the things I want to get stuck into when I'm there. I'll be joining as I think I'm the 10th city architect. 9 of them have been men, all 10 have been white. And in a city as diverse as Malmö, I'm more than aware of the kind of contradictions and problems, even in the idea that there should be a single city architect, who somehow holds the vision of what a city should be. So a lot of my work early on is going to be really listening and understanding to a kind of broader set of voices and helping Malmö's built environment profession and the Stadsbyggnadskontoret, the city planning office, rethink how they can properly reflect and represent the people they serve. And I'm going to be living in Rosengård, in that no-go zone that Trump described, and really hopefully providing a model for perhaps the next 20 years of urban development in Scandinavia, which hopefully will be just as groundbreaking as what Christer Larsson did, and kind of continuing that tradition of being progressive, but with a real focus on integration and socioeconomic development.
Lika till, which Google Translate tells me is good luck in Swedish. So yeah, good luck, and it's a great adventure.
perfect pronunciation, Peter. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Good to see you.